Before we start, today's episode includes firsthand accounts of combat and an honest conversation about veterans' mental health, including PTSD and suicide. If you or someone you know is struggling, dial 988 for the National Suicide Hotline and press 1 if you're a veteran. Someone will answer. Thank you and enjoy today's episode. Well, hello there, and welcome back to One Call. This is a podcast where we dive into success. We look at people's lives, and they invite us into their worlds, and we get to hear some pretty cool stories and some inspiring truths through the eyes of some people that I've met in my circle, acquaintances, and today, this is the first time I've met our guest. His story, I know I say this a lot, but his story is why this podcast exists. I'm humbled to have him on the show to begin with, and I'm excited to hear about his world and his struggles, his triumphs. It truly is an honor to have him on the show. The show is brought to you by Service 360 Group. We are a home services company out of Berks County, Pennsylvania. We specialize in HVAC, plumbing, and electric, but I promise you, if you have a problem around your home or business, we can help you. Give us a call. But without further ado, I would like to welcome onto the show Silver Star, 3 times Bronze Star with Valor recipient, 3 times Purple Heart recipient, the Meritorious Service Medal Award, and the Army Commendation Medal with Valor recipient, Captain James McCormick. James, thank you for being on the show today. First of all, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Man, I'm doing good, and I'm very happy to have you on here, and I can't wait to dig into your story, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. This will make sense later on in the show. But you've said that it was the dirt that quieted it. What did that first day back on the farm actually look like for you?
Well, I mean, for me growing up in Appalachia, coming back home from a deployment to Operation Iraqi Freedom, it wasn't like going into what you would call a standard farm. It was trying to find purpose in your life, and nothing seemed to calm me down. I mean, I wasn't like a nervous wreck or anything, but I was an angry guy. You know what I mean? I was pretty angry, and I remember moving back home and coming back and I was working on an old rotten wooden porch, and I was tearing this porch out, and the more that I would tear and bust at this wood, the more relief I would get, and I was just angry, and I was thinking about a friend of mine that was killed in action in February of 2004, Seth DeVorn, very good friend. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, here I am, this guy that's been married, been divorced twice, served many years in the Army. And, here's another guy who's 24 years old and he gets killed in combat, never has children. I have 4 kids. And you start looking at things from a different perspective and ripping down that porch. And then looking around my surroundings, I just started to plant things. I mean, flowers, tomato plants, all around this small area that I'm living in. And there was something about digging in that dirt and doing that work. So I think physical labor falls into that as well. It's like a lot of the things that you see people do, the blue collar jobs and things like that nobody thinks about until you need a mechanic or a clerk or a plumber or a carpenter. You don't think about those things, but but I got out there, and the more that I sweat, I called that sweat equity, man. You get out there and you
Yeah.
start digging in the dirt. But there is something physically that happens when you become more grounded. So the more I would dig into the dirt, the more I would plant stuff, the more I would see things growing. I thought, this is pretty cool, and there's got to be a way that I can not only help myself, but I can help other people. And coming from the area that I came from, neighbors help neighbors.
That's right.
That was Yeah, it's how we grow up. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And the other thing is there was this lack of concern about our quality of food, and who's growing your stuff. I can remember farmers markets. I worked a lot of farmers market stuff, and used to pick corn and sell corn at the farmers market in Charleston, West Virginia. And man, I've hung tobacco. I've done all of that stuff, as a kid growing up. And I can tell you that even our garden that we grew, what people would call a garden back then, they would call it like major farming today, because literally we had an entire acre
Oh yeah.
that tomatoes, pepper, everything that we grew, we canned it, we preserved it, we saved it, we ate it. We made pickled corn. We did all of that stuff.
Yep.
um, you know when you'd go get a can of green beans, it was in a glass mason jar, and you would go open that up, and it would be just fantastic. I mean, there was just the flavor was better. And I knew that what we grew in our garden and on our plot was all natural. I mean, our fertilizer was cow poop and horse poop, that we
Mm-hmm.
would pick up 5-gallon buckets. And I can remember spreading that out along with a coat of hay over your potato patches and your strawberry patches. And it was just a different time. Tomatoes tasted different. You could go pick them right out of the garden. You could, brush them off your pants, and you could just eat them right there. It was, there was no problems. But there was something about, returning to that, getting your hands in the dirt and accomplishing something besides just, as I was tearing that porch up, I realized I'm pretty good at tearing stuff up, but how good am I at building something? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there we are. And kind of a long way around the barn there.
I want to start at the very beginning. You come
About the hand
from
and, yeah.
you come from 3 generations of service. Your father and your grandfather are all Purple Heart recipients.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know, was service ever a choice for you, or was it just the water you swam in, if that makes sense?
For me, it just seemed like that's was a natural calling. So everybody did it in our family. It was just, we had a lot of World War II veterans in our family. It was, not only, my dad and his dad, but it was also many uncles and cousins and relatives. And I was always fascinated by history, and always fascinated by, the stories. And if you go back, we had one guy that was in World War One. I can remember talking to him about his service, in France, and what it was like to get there. And he said it was just a rush to try to get there before the war was even over. He says, you got to understand, it's like it took a long time to go across the Atlantic Ocean, land in France, and then it would take weeks to get to the front line. He said, so a lot of times, he said, if you left here in 2000 or, in 1917, well, the war was getting close to being over, because it'd be almost, it'd be months before you'd get there. And
Can I ask a clarifier here?
yeah, yeah.
Did you say he was rushing to get there before the war would be over? Like he wanted to get there so bad,
Yes,
to
absolutely. Yeah.
serve his country? That
Yes.
is they don't make it like that anymore.
Well, and during World War II, it was even, more prevalent because I had uncles that were ended up in the Navy as machinist mates, but they wanted to be Army infantry. So they'd go down to the Army, and the Army would say, "We've got so many people that are already here. Um, go try the Navy recruiter." They were just trying to get into uniform so that they could serve their country. And I think that says a lot for the character, of the Americans in general. But my family, it was, if there was something going on, your country was at war, and you didn't serve, you better have a good reason for not serving. Because they would.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd sit at family reunions. I can remember we'd go to this big park called Raven Park up in St. Albans, and there would just be, dozens and dozens of these old war vets, and my dad was the youngest one then coming back from Vietnam, and they would be drinking bottles of beer, and I can even remember the smell of that. You know what I mean? Those guys sitting around drinking beer,
Yeah.
talking about being in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and then the oldest, you know, Goldie would be sitting there, and he would be talking about World War One. You guys don't know what it was like. You have no idea. And it was always, in fun. But there were some horrifying stories. I mean, when people were reading about it in a book, I could sit there and listen to those guys sitting around drinking beer, and I learned history real quick. I learned how bad it was to fight, the Hun in World War One, and the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II, the Koreans in the Korean War, and then of course the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong in Vietnam. And um, now my dad and his brothers, they all went, and they, they didn't talk a lot about it. I mean, but I know my dad was in a lot of
Yeah.
violence. He was with the 173rd Airborne, and he got wounded while he was over there pretty bad. And then he went back again a second time, volunteered to go back again. And none of them were drafted. Not a single one of them were drafted. Every one of them had the RA, regular Army, or they enlisted. And
Yep.
so
They
when
signed up
people
for it.
say, yeah, they didn't have to be forced to go, and they volunteered to go to Vietnam, and they volunteered to go to Korea, and um, but especially during World War II. And I think that World War II generation, that really put that emphasis on our family. If you didn't go, you better have a good reason. And if you ever watch the movie Hacksaw Ridge, when you talk about that experience, and that Medal of Honor recipient who was a conscientious objector. When he stood before the board, he said, "Look," he said, "I had two friends I went to high school with. They committed suicide because they couldn't get in because they were disqualified for a physical reason to go in. So they killed themselves because they couldn't handle the shame of not serving their country." And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that that's what we ever want to get back to, but that's how important it was for these folks. It was very, very important, and there's a lot of pride in service to your country. It's not an arrogant pride, but it's. My dad told me this one time. He said, "You serve your country, you do your time honorably." He says, "and you don't have to owe. You've earned your right to be a citizen of this nation." That's what he told me. He said, "You've earned the right to be a citizen of this nation, and you don't owe anybody anything." That's what he told me. He says, "You don't owe anybody an explanation. Whatever you did, you know." And I told my sons essentially the same thing. Two of them enlisted. One went in the Air Force and one went in the Army. So yeah, we. But I have 8 kids, and only two of the 8 um, currently are serving. I've got 2 other ones that are still young and at the house, and who knows what they'll do. You never know what their future's going to bring them.
You just did an excellent job at describing, what it meant to you and your family to serve. I want to ask you about watching your dad come home from Vietnam, and it was. There's no secret. I mean, there's a lot of people who didn't believe in why we were over there.
Sure.
So collectively, your family was united and your circle was united in support of this country. Did the outside noise and the anti-war noise do anything to you guys, or did you just tune it out and stay heads down and in full support? And did you learn anything through that?
Yeah, I did, because we weren't totally immune from it, because I was in Fort Stewart, Georgia, with my dad when I was really young, just getting ready to go into kindergarten, and he was coming back from his second tour in Vietnam. And you know, the interesting thing about that experience was that when you got around larger cities, you could see, you always knew there was there was either a riot because of the, race, or it was the war in Vietnam, or it was just the counterculture that they talk about today. Um, but I can distinctly remember, there were some teachers when I did come back to West Virginia, and would have been around 73, 74. There were some teachers in our grade school that were absolutely opposed to the war, and there were two of us that still had daddies that were serving. That's the latter part of the war. My dad had already been to Vietnam twice, and he was in Germany, and we were going to school back home in West Virginia, living with my mom, um, and there was some. I can remember, there was some teachers that I don't think, subscribe to that level of patriotism, but now the majority of the school, we said the Pledge of Allegiance, we prayed, we did a lot of different things like that. But again, we saw a little bit of that. Now, where I really saw that treatment was on the 6 o'clock news, when I would see what would happen to these guys,
Yeah.
even and then whenever the fall of Saigon happened. And then my dad got out of the Army in 1976 and started going to the VA Medical Center. And I went with him a couple of times in the late 70s. And the place was a filthy mess, man. It really was. I mean, it was filthy. It was, I can remember just as plain as day, the hallways were full. You had World War I veterans that were in there. You had World War II, Korea, Vietnam guys just starting to come in. And my dad was in there, and there were guys. The trash cans were overflowing. I remember seeing a mouse coming around the trash can, and they used to give you bags of popcorn when you was in there. You'd go get a bag of popcorn, and I'd see these old guys throwing popcorn and watching the mouse run up to grab the popcorn. And that's the kind of way that things were in the 70s. People don't remember that. I remember that. Um, and I can remember, you know, not a lot being done for my dad. I don't, especially the mental health side of it. We didn't talk about it much, but he would have horrible nightmares. I mean, just, you know, God
Sure.
Almighty, man. I remember him screaming and, I come walking down the hall one time and snuck up, was going into the bathroom, and he grabbed a hold of me, I mean, and was just, I didn't recognize that look in his eyes, but the things that he said to me, was just shocking. And then he realized, he woke up in the middle of this night terror that he had. Um, but he always had this large scar that went down his arm where he was gunshot over there. Um, and he was never ashamed of his service. He was always proud of his service. But he was disappointed towards the end, and he got out because, what he thought was a pardoning of the draft dodgers, the guys that were allowed to come back to the United States, who had avoided the draft and ran to Canada and Europe and everywhere else. And he thought, that's not right. I mean, the rest of us, didn't get that opportunity. It wasn't an opportunity that they would have accepted anyways. So I think that still bothers that generation, and I know it does because I talk to a bunch of them, where I work at with Vietnam Veterans of
Yeah.
America. So, yeah.
So we've established your foundation and the role that serving our country has played in not only your life but the lives of many generations before you, your uncles and your entire family. You enlisted in '85 when you were 17 years old.
Mhm.
What did you think you were signing up for then? And did you ever imagine it would lead to what it has led to for you?
No, I just figured I would go in and serve my tours and would go in and if a war broke out, I would participate, and that was it. I went in originally into the West Virginia National Guard because my parents would not let me join the regular army. They would not sign the release form. So I wanted to go in now. I was 17, still in high school, and so the Army recruiter was like, "Well, if you go in the National Guard, you'll go to basic training, you'll go to AIT. When you come back 6 months later, you can transition you'll be 18, then you'll be able to transfer over to the active duty." And that's what I did. I went in, started drilling from August '85, graduated high school in 1986. Went to basic and AIT at Fort Knox, Kentucky as a cavalry scout, and came back. And I knew right then when I was there, I said, "This is the life for me." But not being 18 years old, I didn't have the patience to wait. you know, 6 months later, I started being a soldier as soon as I could. And and then when that happened, I was 18. Nobody could tell me what to do anymore. And I went down to the recruiting station and I got a conditional release and I went active duty and was sent to Fort Stewart, Georgia, where and the only reason why I selected that is because I had been there as a kid with my dad. And I said, that sounds, I can remember it being a pretty cool place, going to the beach and stuff. But boy, it wasn't
Some
anything like that when
familiarity
I
for
got
you.
there. Yeah. But yeah,
Yeah.
it wasn't like that when you got there. You realized real quick this was a serious unit. They were part of the Rapid Deployment Force, heavy mech, the only heavy mech division in the Army at the time was what they called an RDF, Rapid Deployment Force. So, that made life pretty busy. From day one. So, getting there, went to Egypt right off the bat. We had Operation Bright Star 87. Got there in August of 1987. Stayed there about a month and then came back home. It was cool. I'm like, here I am. I've been in the active duty for, a couple of months and I've already been to Egypt. I've been to Germany. I've been all over the place. I've seen different places, flying over and flying back. So it was a big deal for an old country boy like me. Excuse me.
And so you spent 16 years enlisted, and
Hmm.
then 16 years in, you were commissioned to become an officer. Um, what did those 16 years teach you? Because I know this. All you need is a college degree, and you could be commissioned as an officer upon enlistment, right?
Yeah, yeah, you go through an
So
officer training program, but yeah.
but what did those 16 years of service? How much better of an officer did that make you? What did you
Well,
learn there that you wouldn't have been able to learn anywhere else?
I learned humility more than anything. I learned humbleness. I learned what it was like to be that private that was digging the foxhole, what it was like to be under good and bad leadership. So I got to see really bad leadership and I got to see some really good leadership. I'd already been to war during Desert Storm, very fast, very violent, heavy mech war. Um, I'll tell you that place molded me big time because as a 22-year-old sergeant E5 at that time, I had a crew of 16 soldiers, and I had an armored personnel carrier, and my responsibility was all of these younger soldiers, younger. Here I am, 22, but they were all like 18, 19, maybe 20 years old, and you know I remember my first sergeant looking at me and said, "Your job is to keep them alive. Keep them alive. do your job as a scout. You go out, you reconnoiter, you look for the enemy, you fix on targets, you call for fire, you take out what you can take out, and then you work with the infantry at that point. So it was, it taught me a lot of patience as well, because then when I became a staff sergeant and I had duties as an instructor, so I was also an instructor. So in that 16 years, I spent, 6 years on active duty. And then after that, I got out, was in the National Guard again. And then I became what they call an active Guard reserve soldier. So I was a recruiter. So I got to be a recruiter and an instructor. And, and I got this great job working for Tyson Foods in 2000. And, yeah, it was mid 2000. And, I got promoted and became the executive director of safety and security for Northeast Coast Tyson Foods. So imagine 80 some $1,000 a year job back in that time. That's a lot of money. Had a credit card,
You were
had a
doing good.
car. I was doing real good. I'm at the pinnacle. I'm in the National Guard. I'm with an infantry unit. You know what I mean? I'm like, I loving this life. I'm doing my drills, doing my 2 weeks. And one of my locations, my office was in Buffalo, New York, but I also had a cold storage warehouse about 6 blocks from the Twin Towers. And so literally I was in Tennessee when 9/11 occurred and got called to active duty, right after that. And ended up pulling guard duty like most guard units did for that first, few months after, or that first few weeks after 9/11. Well, about 3 weeks or 4 weeks into that duty, this would have been late September 2001, my job wanted to know if I could come off of active duty orders and go up to New York to assess a cold storage warehouse, for my civilian job. And I was able to get released and go to New York. When I went to New York, let me tell you, when I went into New York City and the place was still smoking, I made a decision right then and there. I was like, I'm not going to wait for the Army to call me. Now, I called went over and I saw this site and I talked to some people, and most everybody that worked in that facility knew somebody that either died or was a firefighter or a police officer that was, in the building or was killed in the rescue efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing all that carnage and destruction, I made my mind up. I said, I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to go back on active duty. I don't care if they make me a private. I'm going to go back. Well, so two things. Number one, I had to tell my job that I'm leaving. Number two, it's an $80,000 a year plus job. Okay, I'm going to either
Yeah.
quit or the military's going to take me and they're going to allow me to, get my job when I get back. I mean, there was a lot of things going through my mind, but I wasn't thinking about anything other than I want to get in this war and I want to do my part because I've got something to give. Well, the National Guard unit I was in was not on any deployment cycle. So I went to the National Guard and I said, I'm asking for a release, conditional release. I'm going to go back on active duty. And I went and I met with the commander. I was a platoon sergeant at the time. And they said, well, we're really going to need you here because we're probably going to get deployed. I don't know where we're going. I'm like, I mean, I get all that. I said, but sir, I can't be here. I've been to New York. I don't want to, I'm just going to tell you, it's terrible. I need to go. And so it just so happened the deputy commander of that state National Guard was there, and he said, well, he says, I'll sign your release and let you go back on active duty, but I want you to understand that we need officers because whether you believe it or not, within the next 6 months to a year, this war is going to be carried on the back of the National Guard because they're not going to draft, and we're going to be At that time, we didn't realize we were going to be in a two-front war, but we kind of did know that we were going to be in a two-front war. We thought it was all going to be on Afghanistan, and then Iraq happened, and then boom. And so he said, there's a program. It's a direct commission program. You got a college degree, you got combat experience. And he said, he says, you got a great background. He said, would you be interested in a direct commission? And he said, he says, it's hard. I got to tell you, you got to apply, you got to turn in paperwork, you got to, go before a board. He says, but if you do, we'll commission you as an armor officer. He said, because that's where we need officers at right now. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And I did my paperwork, and that would have been, by that time you're talking February of 2002. So September, November, December, February, January, February 2002. By April, I was standing before a board and in front of 3 commissioned officers, answered about a dozen questions. And this colonel stood up and he says, well, you want us to pin you now? I said, I'm sorry, sir. And he said, we're going to commission you. He says, we're going to approve your commission. He said, we got to get a federal recognition. He said, and I got to be honest with you, we haven't done a direct commission since Vietnam. And said, most direct commissions are chaplains, lawyers. He said, this is a whole new thing for us. He said, but I think you got a pretty good shot. And he said, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to promote you, pending your federal recognition, to second lieutenant. And right there on the spot, man, they come up with a pocket knife. The guy was a Vietnam vet from the 1st Cav Division, this colonel. He cut my stripes off, and he pinned second lieutenant bars on the top of my, on my shoulders. And I said, well, sir, I said, I'm out of uniform. I don't have stripes on my pants. He said, no, it's okay. He says, as soon as you can get them stripes sewed on, on your pants. And I became a second lieutenant, and I was shipped to a unit and was sent to the National Training Center. Never had, and they gave me command of a tank company. And I went through, the training to become an armor officer. And when I come back from that, the Army, if you look at the direct commissions for 2002, there were 2, and I was one of them. There was me, and there was another guy that was an engineer, that were direct commissions. Now, since then, there's been several. But when I come back, you become a direct commission. You are at the will and pleasure of the Army. So the Army said, we need short-range air defense artillery officers, so we're sending you to Fort Bliss, Texas. So they sent me to Fort Bliss, Texas, February of 2003. I was there till July 2003, going through short-range air defense artillery school. Still a second lieutenant, transitioned from armor to air defense. When I came back, they put me on active duty orders. And I started working in the the G1, which is admin. I'm like, I know nothing about admin. And essentially, they just kept me on active duty because they knew I was going to get deployed with a unit. And then I got called into the office, and this, he just retired as the adjutant general from the state of Ohio. And General Harris, he said, Lieutenant McCormick, he says, they need platoon leaders at the 1487th. I said, well, what kind of unit's that? He said, well, it's a transportation unit. I said, well, sir, I'm not a transportation officer. He looked at me, he says, they're not going to utilize you for your transportation skills. He said, they're gonna do some new stuff over there. They got a lot of convoys that are getting hit in Iraq, and they need somebody to help protect these convoys. And so I went over with the full expectation of working with a transportation unit. But when I got there, I found out real quick, well, you're here because, you're going to build this gun truck unit. And we ended up building, the 518th Combat Gun Truck Company, which with with Captain Rob Landry and some others. But there was a lot of heartache that went
Can
with
I
that.
stop you there for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
What is, dumb that down for me. What is a gun truck unit? And like, what would have been your purpose as this gun truck unit?
I often ask myself that. I thought that they sent me over there to get me killed after a while, but it was, uh, it was designed to protect long lumbering convoys that were traveling all over Iraq to deliver supplies, everything from
Okay,
beans to bullets. Yeah.
So you weren't necessarily a transport unit, but you were the security for the transport
Yeah.
unit. You weren't
A whole lot of
hauling, Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and when I first got there, some of the first things was to ride around with these convoys. And the first convoy I went on in February of 2004, we were hit. We were hit by small arms fire and an IED. Boom. Two guys wounded. Machine guns raked the side of the vehicles. It was rather insignificant but compared to what followed after those days. But it was a big wake up call, because it's like, well, where's your heavy weapons? Why are people not deploying and taking out the enemy? Well, it's because they're truck drivers. Their job is to deliver the stuff from point A to point B. And they said that's the reason why we need guys like you that are going to be in Humvees and they're going to be like wolf packs and going around to protect these guys as they're driving these supplies.
And what were they hauling?
It was hard. Anything. It could be, they were 915 Freightliner trucks. They could haul a flatbed full of, vehicles. I've seen them carry armored vehicles, lots of ammunition, lots of explosives, um, food. Sometimes you get a reefer truck that they would carry. But then we also had a mix of civilian trucks. So there were civilian truck drivers that weren't armed and they had no up armor on their vehicles whatsoever. And they were driving over there in the stuff like you'd see here on the road in America. So there was, there was this, it was a big problem. It really was a big problem. So there wasn't a lot of protection. And that was our job. And our job was to take the heat from the enemy and to give it to the enemy. And that was really tested through March and April of 2004. And I can tell you, those were some of the most significant battles. Some of the things that you're reading about in there was the attack, relentless attacks by the enemy. I mean, multiple combined arms attacks. These guys were not stupid. And any time that the one thing I was telling, a lot of these guys in these transport units, most of their officers were trained on a peacetime transportation concept. They knew how to read maps really well. They knew how to load gear really well. They understood basic fundamental soldiering things, but they definitely didn't understand how to break out of an L-shaped ambush or a linear ambush, near ambush, far ambush, the difference between a mortar impact and an IED. And then they weren't ready for, the all-out frontal assaults that you would face. I mean, there were some of these battles where the enemy was less than 50 to 25 meters from your vehicle. I mean, they were close.
Yeah.
And they were really trying to kill you. I mean, it wasn't a game. It was like, but their mindset was on that civilian. And then during Desert Storm, the majority of them drove trucks to and from what they called Tap Line Road. Well, Tap Line Road was still in a relatively safe area. So they were in Desert Storm. They had to deal with scuds and all of that, but they'd never been ambushed before. They'd never, heard the sound of an AK-47. And, my experience in Desert Storm, I had, I'd seen, everything from BMPs to T-72s to to even an aircraft at one time. But the majority of it was small arms fire, from the guys, the crunchies on the ground. And I can tell you it was a significant challenge. It was a challenge.
So we're up to you referenced 2004 in 2005. You said 2004 was the big one. Was that was the
Yeah, the
biggest
Battle of Baia. Yeah,
and that was the one that involved getting assets to the Baghdad International Airport. Is that what it was?
yeah, run through four consecutive ambushes, with trucks, and then four times we ran back through that same area on Route Irish that same day. So, we went back and forth, and then ended up going back to the green zone, what we call running naked, because we went back to pick up the fifth convoy, and there was no fifth convoy to pick up. So then we just had to turn right around and just, and that was, by that time, it was a long day. It turned my hair gray, man. I mean, it really did. It
I
was bad,
I
bad,
can
bad time.
imagine. I just
Yeah,
really want to put this into perspective for people because what you were doing, you were getting assets from A to B. You got
right.
uh uh you were attacked on the first run, right?
Big time. Yeah, we were. Well, I mean, we had got attacked going into that thing, and I mean, I had been shot, and three of my crew members were wounded, and we were in the hospital, and then got put out, and we're sitting at an area right next to the west wall of Biop that was attacked. So we spent that whole time, Easter Sunday, from noon until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, fighting off an insurgent attack that some people said it was more than 100. I don't know. I know we killed 19 of them that were right there in front of us because they were counting them. But I don't know. To be honest with you, they were everywhere. But somebody asked me, I said, "There's lots. There's lots of them out there." Um,
Of
but yeah,
course.
it was crazy.
And the thing that I can't stop, like the thing that I can't get out of my mind is like you got hit on the first run. You were injured on the first run of this
Yeah,
convoy. And then you had to
yeah,
go back not once, not twice,
yeah,
not three times, but four more times. And
yeah.
and all of this was taking place on Easter Sunday.
Hmm.
On Easter Sunday. I was This was in 2004, correct?
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
14 years old, probably dyeing eggs with my family, just got back from Easter Sunday service, and across the world, you are risking your life for my ability to do that with my family. And that is something that I could never thank you enough for. And that stuff goes on all the time. It's going on right now, And I don't think people over here think about that enough. They don't. And it's obvious that they don't do that. I don't want to there's going to be a time and place for this. It's not this point in the story, but I had to say something
Yeah.
about that because it really put things in perspective for me there. So 2004, 2005, you were wounded both years, and then you decided to go back.
Yeah.
Your family history, kind of backs that up. But what makes you do that? Like what makes you feel that like call and desire and like need to serve your country and because I admire it and I got to know.
Um, so when I volunteered to go this time, it was to go to Afghanistan because I didn't go to Afghanistan, and I felt like that's where a lot of this crap started at. So it's like
Yeah.
the guy that went to the European theater in World War II that then fought like heck to get to fight the Japanese in the Pacific once they could get out of the European theater. And some of them got to do both. And when I went to volunteer, the only position they had was a battle captain. They called it a battle captain. So I'd be working on staff. But I figured, I'm going to go there with an infantry unit. We're going to be, these guys are going to be kicking in doors. They're going to be protecting mobile, military supply routes, MSRs. And I've got something to offer there. I've got some, some intelligence that I can offer there. And then I'm not afraid. It's not about being afraid of going. People are scared. I mean, I've been scared, man, many times in my life. I was scared during all of those times, and your heart's just racing, and it's like you can't even swallow. You know what I mean? And you feel like you're going to just have
Yeah,
a stroke.
I can't
Uh,
imagine. I cannot imagine. Continue. I'm sorry.
well, it's so when I volunteered to go, I went there and I started going through the process, went through all the training, and in 2007, 2007, um, I got a message, and they said, well, you need to go down and do your physical, and you've been wounded more than once, so we have to see if you're medically and mentally capable, because you're volunteering. I mean, literally, they told me that. And he said, and you're not a spring chicken at that time. I was 37 when I was over there. I was 37 years old, man. I was an old guy, and
And
it
you're
was
saying
like,
that they had to clear you to make sure you were you weren't crazy, that you really wanted to go back over there. They had to mentally clear you for that.
yeah, well, I was a company commander at the time as well, and I was hard on the company. I was hard, but I was fair. Um, and some may question that, but the bulk majority of the members of my company still call me sir, and still call me, and we wish each other Merry Christmas and Happy Birthdays. And I've been there. One guy, his wife just died of cancer. I was there with her, praying with her and praying with him and holding his hand, gave him, a service dog, after his wife had passed. And all of these things mean that I didn't do too bad, but there were some, I mean, they just didn't get it. But I was training them to go to war. I didn't train them to be their buddy. I wanted them to live.
Yeah.
I mean, the worst thing for me is to know that that same day on April the 11th, 2004, Easter Sunday, I watched a helicopter go down and take two wonderful American lives right there, right there, right where we were at. I watched the chopper get hit and I watched it come down. It wasn't like it was like right in front of me, but we saw it. We got it on video, actually. Some guy was
Yeah.
shooting a video of us fighting this battle, and this helicopter gets shot down. And at that point in time, it was just crazy. And then the fact that that same day, I think if you'll look and check, there were 7 American lives that were lost on Easter Sunday, 2004. Fighting the same enemy that I was fighting at a different location, but all in the same area. There were, 100 plus that were wounded. I mean, it was, and I wasn't the only one wounded. I mean, everybody on my crew was hit by small arms fire or shrapnel more than once. You know, my driver, you know, took a bullet fragment that went all the way through his cheek and out the other side. I mean, he got hit in the face, and he had a little holes here, and it was like never touched his tongue, never broke a tooth, um, and he just shook his head and got back up and went on fighting. I've never seen anything like it. The courage of the Americans soldier is incredible, and the Marines. Because there were a lot of Marines that we fought alongside of later on. But my decision to go back was based on what I felt was a need to offer what I had left in me. I'm almost 40 years old at the time. And so when I go there, I had a battalion commander that didn't subscribe to my school of thought on training. He liked to be their buddy. You know what I mean? And I'm like, being your buddy will get you killed, man. It will get you killed. You got to train these soldiers to be soldiers. If not, then don't be surprised when they do stupid stuff over there, or they say, no, I'm not going to do it. And I saw some of that, when I was overseas. I saw some people refuse to drive trucks because they said it was too dangerous. And I even had guys in the gun truck unit that said, I can't do it no more, sir. So there needed to be what I thought was a level of maturity, the old guy that could be there to say, it's okay, or to kick you in the rear end a little bit to get you going, but do it in a loving way. There's a loving way to kick somebody in the rear end to get them to do the job. Because the worst thing, and I'll tell you, the worst thing you'll ever see is someone that comes back from one of those deployments. The biggest mental breakdown I've seen in a lot of people is those that didn't do what they thought they should have done in the deployment, or they hesitated, or they froze. And a lot of that can be fixed with adequate training and discipline. Um, we're asking these guys to potentially die for us, to go forward. You're going to potentially give your life to fulfill this mission that you may not believe is needed. You may not think that delivering, pallets of water, to a base camp is worth giving your life for. But it was the mission. So no matter what we were
Yeah.
protecting, by God, we gave it back to the enemy tenfold with a bayonet on the end of it. And I wanted to teach that. So when I got there, the battalion commander that I was with, he said, he says, I've seen some of this stuff. He said, I just don't know. He said, we're going to send you down. So we had to do the whole medical. And it wasn't the psychological. It was the fact that I had a traumatic brain injury. I had no idea I had a traumatic brain injury. But sometimes I would just get dizzy. Sometimes I would, would, whatever, days out. Um, I
And
used
this
to
was
hear a
over there
cricket
the
sound
third
in my
time?
ear. Well, no, this was, I was going over for the third time, and then this is where they medically retired me. So I ended up being medically
So,
retired
okay.
in 2009. So yeah, but I spent a year, I spent a year plus at Fort Knox, Kentucky, going through the Warrior Transition Battalion, and that was, God put you in places that you need to be. And when I got there, what I noticed was just how horrible that the Army was treating some of our combat wounded soldiers. And it wasn't the Army in whole, it was these WTUs, these warrior transition units. And they would put these guys and gals in charge of these WTUs, and there'd be, privates and sergeants and captains and all these people in this WTU. And you would have this E5 or this E6 that would come out and say, well, first, let me tell you, don't confuse your rank with my position, and just started with this, it's like they were trying to, an ego measuring contest. And these guys were
And
in
so it's
there, had all been
ego.
shot and everything else, and, and I can remember one of them coming out, this E6 coming out. And I said, look, I'm going to tell you something. I said, I don't know how all these other people, I said, but you're not going to come out here and talk, to these warriors that have been there and done that. You know what I mean? You have no right
Yeah.
to talk to them like they're privates, in a basic training, company. It's just, and then the way they were living, the barracks and stuff. But that all changed. So I mean, I ended up talking to this, to this colonel who said, I understand you have a problem with the way the WTUs run. I said, I do, sir. I have a big problem with it. And I told him exactly what I saw, what I didn't like. And that was at the time that everyone started blowing the whistle on some of this stuff. But they ended up cleaning it up. I mean, it was like in, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 months later, they started changing things. And they put them in actual quarters and not these old World War II barracks and treating them like cattle. That was, that wasn't a good thing. I mean, and then I'm sure you heard about Walter Reed, the big Walter Reed scandal, and all of the mold and the issues with the conditions. And these guys were walking outside of Walter Reed Hospital and getting mugged, taking an exercise walk, after fighting for their country. We had them in crap
Yeah.
like that. I mean, that was, so I think, while I was disappointed that I didn't get to go to Afghanistan and go for my third tour downrange. So basically, there was a lot of investigations going on because it wasn't just going on at Fort Knox. It was all over the country. But I was able to control that little bit of the world that I was in at the time. And ironically, my whole career basically started at Fort Knox. So I was, a trained there in basic training, and my wife would come out there with me, and we would when we were going through that whole process of getting out. There were a lot of things that were going on. So it was good that I was there. I think that was my purpose. You know what I mean? And I believe that.
Yeah.
Just like I believe that, you're put in a place, you're put in a position because you could impact it. I was put in positions in combat that entire deployment, which was longer than a year. It was a long time. It was over. I mean, it was a long time. I got there. We deployed and got there in late December of '03, and then come home in April of '05. So you're there for like 15 months or something like that. It was just crazy. But you know the combat was one thing. The other thing was dealing with what happens to you when you get out. Because like I said, I didn't want to get out. I wanted to stay in. And so
Yeah.
when the Army said, you can't stay in, I'm like, well, surely there's a job that I can do. And they said, well, there's a couple of things, we could try to get a waiver. And at that time, people that were missing legs and stuff they were giving them different jobs and in various administrative roles that they could do. And I just didn't want to do all that. I mean, at that time, I felt like, okay, I've done all I can do. Um, and it's time for me to hang it up. By the time that I got out, I was 41 years old. So it was it's a young man's game. It really is, and it's tough for somebody that's been wounded multiple times. Dealing with not just the normal aging, but the stuff that's brought on from multiple gunshot wounds and blasts and a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
I thought I was going crazy.
So what I hear you describing, and I think the way that the majority of like our audience will be able to relate to it is like just and this doesn't even come close to it, but just people feel like they're fulfilling their purpose in their job, and for one reason or another they have to leave it, or they retire, and then all of a sudden their life becomes that much less fulfilling, and they feel like they've lost their purpose and their direction. And you were dealing with that on a huge scale, and then on top of that, the past trauma and hardships that come from some of the stuff that you saw in combat. And
Sure.
I can imagine, at 41 years old, you've been enlisted or in the military for the better part of, what is it, 25 years? Is that I'm trying to do math and it's not mathing right now, but yeah.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. But I did take a short break from the military, about a year and a half. But yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
more
That's
than
about
half
right.
of your life, and your identity was tied to the military, and then all of a sudden it's gone. And not
Yes.
only is it gone, one, you don't want it to be gone, and two, you're carrying the weight of everything that you've seen in your time over there.
Hey, I know you guys are probably just now getting into it, but that is where we are going to make the cut. That is going to be the separation between part one, the soldier, and part two, the builder. So part two is going to premiere on Friday night at 5 o'clock, our normal time. So stay tuned for that. But for now, this has been One Call, our part one with James McCormick. We hope that you come back and let us finish his story, because it's a good one, on Friday. This has been one of the more meaningful conversations that I've had in my life. So I'm really excited to share the rest with you. But for now, like the show, follow us on YouTube. We're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, and like and share the show on Facebook. But for now, that's it. We'll see you on Friday.